Hello, everybody, and welcome to our discussion on disinformation and specifically disinformation around COVID-19. Today, we're going to be talking and giving you the Pan-African view on disinformation and COVID-19. We've got a panel of African experts who I'll introduce you to in a while. And they're going to be looking at emerging trends around disinformation and coronavirus in Africa, as opposed to in the US or the EU or elsewhere. So there are some very distinct and different tracks to follow on the continent. They're going to be talking about how this is going to impact on African countries and on the strategies in place in those countries to deal with COVID-19. I see there was a report out on Sunday around how people who watch Fox News are dying at a more rapid rate than those who don't. So as you can tell, the actual impact of disinformation is very real. It's not just being able to make fun of your father for posting some funny video, actually people dying because of this misinformation. And then what's also very interesting to us is taking a look at at how African governments are responding to this flood of misinformation and disinformation. So the larger question for us, I think, is how does this impact democracy and democracies in Africa? How are some governments using the flood of misinformation to crack down in certain ways on legitimate access to information? And then finally, the experts will not just be discussing it in general, but looking at some of the tools and some of the tricks that they use to identify these kinds of disinformation campaigns and use to navigate their way around it. This isn't going to be a training, though, with specific kind of point-by-point analysis of how to deal with misinformation. We do run some training separately, though, so I'll ping everybody who's been watching, and we'll ping you on Twitter and social media and tell you about some actual trainings where we drill down to some of these things going forward. We are taking questions, so there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, so please do fill in questions that you want answered. We'll either take them during the course of the panelists' presentations, or we'll address them at the end of the chat. So we have 4 organizations represented here today. I'm Chris Roper, and I'm the Deputy Director for Code for Africa. Code for Africa is a federation of Pan-African organizations, civic data tech organizations, media organizations, data labs, tech labs. We're in about 20 odd countries in Africa. Part of what we do is we partner with people. So we've partnered with the DFR lab to work to manage a disinformation center for Southern Africa. And then we also have our own iLab in East Africa. And one of the representatives, the managing editor of that, is on our panel today. DFR Lab is a digital forensics research lab. The guys in Southern Africa are focused on looking at specifically sub-Saharan African misinformation. PaceCheck is Code for Africa's fact-checking organization, and Mugendi is the managing editor representing them today, and they concentrate quite largely on East Africa and fact-checking there. And then lastly, Varashini Pillai is our moderator for the panel discussion, and she runs a product called explain.coza, which is around demystifying the news and making the news kind of more accessible to people. So Varashini is an ex-editor of editor-in-chief of Mail and Guardian and an award-winning journalist in her own right, but she's here as representing explain.coza. So I'm going to hand over to Varashini now, and she'll be introducing each panelist just before they talk. So we won't introduce them all right now. We'll wait till their turn comes up. Varashini, let me hand over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Chris, and thanks for that introduction. A big welcome to all our participants. We're really excited that you guys could join us. We want to make this interactive, so at any point, please just drop us your questions, as Chris said. First up, I'm really excited to hear from all the people on our panel today. I think a lot of us hear about the stuff going on in terms of fake news across the continent and think that it's just going unchallenged. But meanwhile, we have these very smart minds behind the scene who are working actively to combat it. So one of those smart minds is Jean Leroux. He is a research associate at the DFR lab that Chris just told you guys about. Jean is a former journalist. He did quite an amazing investigation at News 24 that I'm sure a lot of you will remember, where he's done work unpacking the kind of fake trails that happen and the machinery behind the fake news that happens. So he also has worked with the public protector as an investigator. And he's also become an expert at barking dogs on Zoom. So let's hope he does that particularly well during this session, where he's going to unpack for us some of the work he's been doing in this area. Jean, over to you.
Thanks, Varashni. I'll try my best with the two dogs barking in the background, but if they do pick up on the microphone, my apologies for that. So at the DFR Labs, we've been focusing on sub-Saharan South Africa and specifically on disinformation being propagated within the South African and the sub-Saharan African context. We've been taking a look at some of these campaigns since about January this year, and just slightly before the start of the outbreak of the coronavirus. And some of the very first things that we actually picked up on the disinformation surrounding the virus was that there's quite a lot of commercial disinformation. It was quite interesting. One of the very first instances we found was where a marketing company based in Cape Town was actually creating these Facebook pages and Facebook groups that was being used to initially spread awareness around the virus. It was being used as a platform for people to share their experiences about the virus and share information around it. But what quickly happened was that these groups that were based in various geographical locations, including South Africa, quite a few was based in the US, some in the Philippines. There was quite a big network in Australia. And all of these groups would eventually almost kind of become vectors for the spreading of disinformation and misinformation themselves. So it was quite interesting for us to pick up on that. And we kind of, almost happened on the group. And then we quickly realized, but this group is being run by a marketing firm based in Cape Town, which is quite odd. You'd expect somebody like an NGO or perhaps a kind of a health or a civic organization to be running such a kind of program, but not specifically a marketing agency. It was while still doing the investigation, we kind of picked up on that this marketing company was pivoting over into selling and marketing face masks to these, specifically to these groups. So you had a situation where a company that's not aligned with the, kind of the health objectives, creating these groups, filling it with people who are themselves vulnerable to coronavirus-related marketing, and then at the end of the day coming out and saying, well, since you guys are all here, here's a bunch of face masks that you can buy from me. And I mean besides the... Sure, Varashni?
Yeah, I found it fascinating that it was so blatantly a commercial endeavor, but it was quite sophisticated in its execution.
Yeah, I mean, the network was exceptionally large. There were pages, I think we identified, there was about 50 or 60 of them based specifically in South Africa, focusing on small regions like George and Knysna and Pretoria, small geographical areas. And then there were these larger networks based in foreign jurisdictions like Australia, the Philippines, the US, I think Brazil and Canada also featured. So besides the ethical concerns with creating these groups and then using them to market to people, you also have the situation with these groups, because of the lack of moderation, a lot of these groups became vectors for the spreading of the disinformation themselves. Even the moderators who were supposed to keep things in check ended up sharing a lot of this, links to dodgy news websites and miracle cures and things like that.
And John, can I ask you, what is the kind of emotional hook that gets people to even join these groups? I mean, okay, firstly, when I read your article explaining what happened, it was quite sophisticated. If I was someone who was already sitting in South Africa or Knysna and feeling concerned, I might join that group. But how do these groups appeal? How do these marketing people appeal to us in our fear? What is it about their tactics that get us to click on them instead of going to the WHO website?
It was actually one of the things that was mentioned in the group. Besides the group saying, the part of the group rules was that nobody's allowed to advertise and nobody's allowed to fearmonger. One of the things that the page admin appealed to in one of the posts was actually leveraging on that fear. I recall there was a post that they made where they said that there are so many people that have passed away in Italy because of the virus. What are you doing to protect you and your family?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing that will make people think, oh my goodness, what am I doing? How am I going to protect? And it plays on
Even
that
though
fear.
our context is completely different in South Africa to what it was in Italy.
Exactly, yes. So I mean, these kind of commercially oriented, disinformation campaigns, they do evolve. Some of the others we've seen is where they've taken existing campaigns and then kind of just rebranded them to fit into the new coronavirus context. So as an example of that, we recently did an investigation where we focused on a particular scam being shared on WhatsApp, which claims that you've won this 5,000 Rand Woolworths voucher. But by digging into what actually goes on once you click on that link, once you go through the motions of sending that message on to 10 of your contacts, it actually transpired that this was being used as a way to harvest your personal information. So you go through the motions thinking that you will be receiving this grocery voucher from Woolworths. Meanwhile, it's a company based in Hong Kong that's taking your data and then selling that onto what's most likely a bunch of South African insurers.
Wow. And Jean, what are the measures in place to protect vulnerable audiences from doing that? I mean, was it very convincing looking? Did it look just like a Woolworths website? And what can audiences do, if people are watching this video right now, to make sure that that's not them that gets the information harvested by some scam?
Yeah, it was quite well executed. The way in which the link, people know by now to take a look at the link and make sure the link doesn't look suspicious. But the way they actually created this link made it seem like a legitimate link. It looked like a woolworths.co.za link. If you looked, at a glance.
Yeah.
So, but once you start digging into it, you could see there were small things that would, for example, they didn't use the correct Woolworths logo on all the different areas. And at one moment, they're mentioning a 5,000 Rand voucher, and the next it's a 2,000 Rand voucher. So there's these kind of inconsistencies. I think for the people out there and for the audience, if you receive a link, it's best to be overcautious, especially if it's via WhatsApp. Unlike Facebook and Twitter, which have ways to kind of moderate the content that's being shared on the platform, WhatsApp is a closed box. So even the WhatsApp administrator or the owners of WhatsApp don't have a clue what's being sent and shared on the platform. There's no way for them to make sure you're not receiving a link that will pass on your bank details to the next.
Yes, that's.
Just in a broader sense, and Tessa will pick up on that now. But further, just looking at the broader narrative into Africa, what we've been seeing quite recently is there's this major drive towards more what seems to be an anti-vaccine narrative in Africa. There was a story that went viral. I think about a week or two ago, about 7 Senegalese children that passed away after they were administered a vaccine for the virus. Now, besides the fact that this vaccine does not exist, by looking at the videos that were shared, and we're still busy with that investigation, by looking at the videos that were shared and where they originated from, it actually transpired that this specific video was a misattributed video that was taken from a totally separate instance that happened in late March. So this video was taken, the context was stripped, and it was given the impression that the protest and the violence seen on this clip was based on a protest against the implementation of a vaccine. And the same YouTube channel has also been sharing different clips, some of them from South Africa. There's another one from the Ivory Coast, which shows protests for separate incidents, but then are attributing them to people in Africa coming up and protest against the implementation and the development of a vaccine. So there's a definite drive that seems to be pushing that, and we're busy looking at where it's coming from, what the objectives might be, and who stands to gain from that.
Jean, before we go to Tessa, who, as you say, has been doing some interesting work in this area as well, people are asking, from the audience, just back to that question of what protections are there? Now, I know there's, bills in Parliament and all kinds of things, but Blessing and Profor wants to know, what recourse do people have whose data has been harvested? So that story you did where the company harvested their data, what is the kind of legislative or, justice system?
I mean, we've got the personal that Protection of Personal Information Act that's been kind of in limbo since I think it's about 2015. I think certain sections of the act have already been implemented, but the main thrust of the act, for some reason, that's still being delayed as is. So, I mean, once those measures are in place, it would align the South African information ecosystem to the European Union's GDPR, which incidentally, the same company that's harvesting the data in the Hong Kong region they were actually slapped with a ruling against them in the European Court of Justice because they transgressed the GDPR regulations. So, I mean, once we get that kind of legislative protections in place, we should be able to rely on a bit more protection from the state side insofar as it's possible. Obviously, you can't police every single link being sent, but you can crack down quite hard on companies that are abusing it.
Yeah, I see. I see there's more questions coming in. Thank you. Please keep them coming in. We're going to try to keep to time and try to get to all your questions at the end. We have a panel discussion, so we'll come back to Jean at the end with more about that. But I think a good place to start, if you're interested in this, is in the DFR lab and the work that they're doing and spreading that through our communities, because that's how misinformation spreads. So if we can spread the actual information, I think that's a good start. So Jean, thank you so much for that. And I think that was just a great roundup of how commercial networks are using this to leverage sales, which is really just so opportunistic and awful. But thank goodness for guys like you out there watching it. Tessa is also with a DFR lab, and she's a self-described data nerd, and I can attest to that. And she's a former online and radio journalist. Tessa is a research assistant at the DFR lab, which is really cool. And she's been looking at a story that I think a lot of you guys out there are probably interested in. And it was a story of how this crazy theory about vaccines and this and that just spread like wildfire across the continent. And Tessa specifically looked at how it jumped from like the Congo to here to there, and how it all came together. So I'm really excited to hear about that. Tessa, over to you, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for Ashley. So what I'm going to be talking about is this crazy Bill Gates vaccination story that was picked up by some local news organizations and fringe political parties, and how that actually happened. So I can emphasize how disinformation is amplified on the African continent, because we don't necessarily have all of the checks and balances in place that we need to tackle and to go against this kind of disinformation in our newsrooms or in our political parties. So for those of you who didn't hear about it, this story that Bill Gates had created a vaccination and wanted to test it out on the African population and on the African continent went viral about 2 to 3 weeks ago. And I first noticed it because I saw that Bill Gates was trending on South African Twitter, and I had no idea why, because he hadn't said or done anything that really warranted him trending. And I traced it back, and I noticed that it had originated in a Facebook post from a page located in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it was originally written in French, very poorly written French with a lot of spelling errors. And it was an incredibly inflammatory and sort of racially charged piece of disinformation that people had a very visceral reaction to, understandably, because it was playing on some of the fears that Africa is maybe a testing ground, or that Africa is kind of expendable. And it was widely shared. One of the posts on Facebook got, I think, 42,000 shares, which is quite substantial for a page that only had about 30,000 followers at the time.
Yeah.
So it spread from there into local media, into fringe media, and sites sort of pretending to be media and news organizations. It hopped from sort of Francophone Africa into France, where it was translated into English. It was picked up by a US politician, and then it jumped back to South Africa. So it traveled across the continent via kind of the rest of the world. And in South Africa, it was given a bit of a political undertone as well. So this racially and politically charged piece of disinformation was really being engaged with. And unfortunately, at the same time, 2 French doctors said that any sort of coronavirus vaccinations should be tested on the African population. Obviously, that did not help because it lended this piece of disinformation almost authentic evidence that it was in fact truthful when it wasn't. Things snowballed out of control. It was a bit of a perfect storm. There was a lot of people jumping onto this, and eventually a story about Bill Gates and vaccinations was published by News 24, one of our big news organizations, and then retracted. And the story continued to mutate into this interesting narrative involving the tennis match between Bill Gates and Trevor Noah, saying that there was a plan between them and the South African president to depopulate. And this is picked up by a very small political party in South Africa called the African Transformation Movement. And questions based on this conspiracy theory were sent to the presidency. And those were published on Twitter and Facebook from the ATM's accounts. So what originally started off as a sort of a Facebook post in French in the DRC mutated and traveled to the extent that it was amplified and given authenticity by media and by politicians. And it's kind of a perfect example of the things that we have to be incredibly wary of when it comes to writing and speaking about COVID-19 and the novel coronavirus, because without the necessary checks and balances and without interrogating information, this kind of thing can really easily get out.
And I have to just pick up what you said about the retraction, is that just fuels the fire for those who believe it's conspiracy, right? So I saw lots of people saying, oh, the only reason News 24 retracted it is because their handlers, told them or whatever, like they needed to obey what the, I don't know, reptile people were telling them to do, like the real tinfoil hat kind of things. Like it made everyone even more suspicious, the fact that they retracted it. Never mind that we all know as journalists that retractions and those kind of things are normal, as are mistakes. And I speak from experience, but coming back to like that amplification that happened, from like this, as you say, poorly written little post in the Congo, jumping onto the bandwagon of like 2, kind of French doctors saying racist things, then all the way to South Africa, where now, even as I was tweeting about this event, I had people in my mentions telling me that I am pushing Bill Gates propaganda to depopulate Africa. So that fact has just taken such hold. As a journalist, as someone who has worked in newsrooms, for a while, what do we need to change? Because I feel I can see how that mistake would have happened in my newsroom. It was, it was a junior journalist. They took something that was trending because you're told to get traffic. Aren't we told to do that in newsrooms? Get traffic, find what the audience is talking about. Does this talk to a fundamental flaw in our newsrooms and how they're structured?
I think one needs to be wary of finding stories on social media, because social media does exist in a little bit of a bubble, and often you'll have voices that seem particularly loud on social media amplifying narratives that seem like they're getting a lot of traction and are incredibly important, when if you look outside of social media, they're really not getting all that much attention. So I think we have to be incredibly wary of that, particularly with the knowledge that information can seem like it's getting a lot of interaction and engagement. And without actually interrogating that, we might not have any idea whether that interaction and engagement is authentic. Because it's very easy for me to post something, to go and buy a bunch of bots and to get that post amplified. And then suddenly that makes its way into media because it looks like it's this huge topic that people are talking about. When
I've got to say that even just what you said now, as a former editor and someone who's running a newsroom now, I've never thought about that someone could just buy a bunch of bots to magnify their statement. I mean, that alone, I don't think is widely known enough. I know Chris has something that he wants to add here. Chris, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to ask Tessa or Jean to maybe just give a bit of an example of how this works. So I think the idea that newsrooms can now publish corrections and that news and meaning moves in that linear fashion has obviously not been the case for a long, long time. So when somebody like a News 24 or somebody makes a mistake, it's a much, much more deadly affair than it was before, because it adds legitimacy to the trolls and the misinformation specialists who want to push that agenda. And I think that's why it's so important, the work that the DFR Lab and PacerCheck are doing now, because I don't think a lot of the journalists in the newsrooms in Africa specifically really have the tools to deal with how this works and to understand how it works. And I don't think they've been careful enough. So maybe Jean or Tess, one of you could tell us a little bit about that example of a South African fake news website being used to add legitimacy to the Iranian plane disaster, as an example of how, all you need is like one little bit of token legitimacy from some news site or news organization or fake news organization outside your own ecosystem to then give that legitimacy to your ecosystem.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this was actually something that was done. It was an investigation done by one of our colleagues based in the Ukraine. And he picked up on a narrative being pushed in the Russian state-owned media. It was being pushed by RT and Sputnik, where there were these claims that a US drone was actually responsible for shooting down the Iranian flight. And they linked it back to this small nondescript South African website that was quoting from an anonymous source within the Iranian military. So there's no attribution to the source. Even if you read through the quote that was stated, you could pick up that the quote's not actually saying what the headline was proclaiming. But this was picked up by the Russian media, and then it almost got into this kind of a spin cycle where it was, different publications within the Russian media ecosystem retweeting each other and, kind of engaging and quoting each other. And you had this whole blowout where a conspiracy was born because of a small website based in a different country entirely. So it was one of the. Usually we expect it to be the other way around.
Yeah, so
to bring a conspiracy into your country, but in this case, we were actually the exporters of the conspiracy theory.
Yeah, so just to state the obvious, and forgive me for that. So the two things that work here. The one is that if you make a mistake, like News 24 did, you help the fearmongers and anti-truth people to delegitimize the very idea of truth, but you also allow a spurious truth to be attached to misinformation. So it works both ways. You can't really win. So the only thing that can work here is to not make the mistakes in the first place. I think that's the challenge we have going forward.
Absolutely, Chris. And that's why I also put the question forward. And I'd love for the audience to tell me their views. I see we've got also people, representatives from SANEF watching with us, about what media needs to do, because the reason I've left mainstream newsrooms is because I realized how vulnerable I was to these kind of mistakes because of the very model, right, of how we've done news, of trying to, like Tessa was saying, the danger of chasing those stories that are being amplified on social media falsely. So I think I would love to unpack that more in the panel a bit later. But before we get there, perhaps we can move to a different part of the continent and East Africa, where Mugendi is focused. And I'd like to just introduce him now. Tessa, if you're done, is there anything else more you want to say before we move on?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So Mugendi, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Kenya. As Chris said, he is the managing editor of PacerCheck, which is a fact-checking initiative to verify the confusing numbers that politicians put out there, when they're doing their spiels. He is managing editor, and what else have you? He's a tech journalist covering Kenya and East Africa. So, Mugendi, so good to have you with us. Tell us some of the work that you've been doing and you've been spotting in your region.
All right. So thanks for having me. And I'd say we've been seeing quite a lot of misinformation and disinformation around COVID-19 as the outbreak has progressed. So we started looking at false information from Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania in 2016. So we've been around for quite some time. And during that time, we've been able to establish some partnerships and linkages with different platforms. So we mainly work with false content published on mainstream, or potentially false content, I'd say, published on mainstream media. And we also have a partnership with Facebook to look into false information being shared on the platform. So because of this, we've been able to get some visibility on what people are talking about and what people are sharing on these platforms. And as we've been tracking this outbreak, we've seen three main waves, I'd say, of disinformation. So the first one is before, or like in the initial stages of the outbreak, where there's still speculation about, is it an actual thing? Is it, what's the origin of it? Where is it from? How many people are actually affected? And then, because in the month of March, the countries that we work in, that's Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, all confirmed their first cases. So that was the second phase, where we saw people now speculating about where exactly, now that the disease is in these countries, where are the people who have it located, and could there have been any local transmission or any other instances like those? And then after that, now that we have the confirmation of the first cases, we've seen false information about things like cures and how the disease is actually transmitted. So it's been a very interesting pattern to follow, because in each of these stages, there's the false information comes in some very curious ways. So for example, because Facebook and Twitter are open platforms, we're able to see the conversations that people are having on these platforms, and then we're also able to track how people are interacting with it. And we've seen like entirely false websites being set up, and they're just packed with lots of stories that ride on the fact that there's lots of interest and there's lots of communication around COVID-19. So there's one particular website which sometime in February said that a couple of medical students in Kenya had actually developed a vaccine around the disease. But then the way they were talking about it, where they were saying that the vaccine was being used to treat people who had who had been infected, didn't make any sense. So a lot of these websites are getting some very factual things, some very critical facts about how diseases work wrong. And as a result, we've seen like they're easy to debunk. But then we've seen a lot more nuance in the spread of false information, where people now start saying things like, in addition to the Bill Gates situation that Tessa mentioned, we've seen a post where it says Barack Obama, the former US president, has said that any vaccine that's coming from the US, from Western countries, is likely to be poisonous, or it's likely to be used to control the population. So the thing with the countries we're in is that we've seen much more like imported false information. So this is false information that has been published or that has been shared from other countries, compared to actually locally sourced false information, where people actually generate in country the false information. So the most egregious examples of locally generated false information are false stories about xenophobic attacks on Chinese residents, because Kenya has a significant population of Chinese workers, because we have a lot of infrastructure projects that are funded by China. So they have sent a lot of people. So initially, in the initial stages of the spread of false information, we saw instances where people were saying, in this particular location, the Chinese residents were attacked. So that was a sort of false information we were seeing. But now we're seeing lots of people say things like, if you drink or if you gargle salt water, for example, it's going to wash down the virus and you're not going to get infected. And the fact that this false information usually circulates in closed networks, so WhatsApp and Telegram, where we don't have visibility, which is on Facebook, means that by the time we're intervening as a communication, a lot of the damage is usually done. Yeah.
Yeah, you just broke up there a little bit, but I think what you were saying is that this information circulates in closed networks like Telegram and so on, where people can't actually intervene with the truth. Is that what you said? And I believe I think I saw something on the DFR Lab website actually about how Telegram is being used by the right wing, I think in the US. So that's fascinating how those kind of networks are very valuable in building trust, because trust, let's face it, with public figures and journalists and experts are at an all-time low in our society. So people are turning into these internal networks. But when the information is wrong, it has some devastating effects. It's not just laughing, like Chris said, at at someone who made a bad mistake or circulated fake news in the family group, it leads to consequences on the ground. So people are actually like drinking salt water, or or doing and then going out and exposing themselves. Is that actually happening to the virus?
We've seen situations where people are actually like drinking hot water or drinking tea, and then because one of the things that it says is that the effect of the virus on your chest is that it causes a buildup of mucus, and to get that out, you need to drink lots of fluids and lots of hot water. And so this is actually, we've actually seen situations where people are saying that I think one of the most serious examples that we saw was that Black people can't get the virus, or Black people are immune.
Yes.
So this is because there was a situation, one of the first African cases was a Cameroonian student in Wuhan who actually got infected, and then he recovered. And a couple of websites actually published articles claiming that this is it shows that Black people can't get the disease, which I actually heard like a lot of people mention like in passing. So people keep saying that, oh, obviously we can't get it because it doesn't affect Black people. So it's likely to counter any advice that is being issued by the ministries of health or by the World Health Organization telling people to take precautions, because like psychologically that damage is already done. And then another claim that has a similar effect is that the disease doesn't spread in warm countries, even though we saw Iran, which is quite warm, have quite a serious outbreak of it. So a lot of the damage isn't like immediate, where people start taking these actions, but it's more long term, where people start discounting advice or start looking at the advice they're getting from authorities and saying, after all, this is it doesn't affect me because I've heard.
It's more like a sea change. It's like it affects society in the long term as they become skeptical of science, skeptical of vaccines, skeptical of what experts are telling them. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. I mean that's quite terrifying, and it's interesting to me how the interconnected world works. We're going to talk in a minute about the 5G conspiracy that started, I think, in the UK. But before I get to that, I'm interested in how Africa has been positioned within the pandemic and how that has led to certain sensitivities we have legitimately as Africans being exploited. So we are quite sensitive as Africans about how we're being portrayed in the media. So I think at the beginning of this outbreak, when lots of experts were saying, we don't know why it hasn't taken off in Africa yet, a lot of us were quite offended. Like, what are you trying to say? So and also then, when the vaccine thing happened, it again played into the sensitivities we have about, are African bodies dispensable? Are people just using Africa as a testing ground? So is that the way that the fake information from abroad is able to take a foothold, in that, I guess at the core of every lie, there is a truth, is that we are worried that Africans are being taken advantage of in this pandemic? Have you come across people worried about that?
I think the main thing that, or this fear actually is rooted in the fact that we tend to come last when it comes to all of these interventions, all of these things that are being put in place by different by different bodies, to the point where people are asking, if this disease actually originated in Africa, we would probably be like nuked to bits right now. So it sort of contributes to like a whole, or to this pessimistic view that a lot of people have in terms of where are we in the grand scheme of things. So I think one of the things that has been mentioned as sort of narrative is that anytime like a Western news organization mentions coronavirus, they keep saying, could Africa be hiding the true tally of infections?
Yes.
And so, like, to the point where it's almost insulting.
Where you do feel insulted. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Mugendi. I know you wanted to talk a little bit more about the 5G conspiracy, but I think maybe now's a good time to bring the rest of the panelists so we can discuss that together. Before we do that, there's been a really good question which I'm going to try to answer live. I don't know if that works. So the question is, how much of the observed activity, like in the DRC, Kenya, South Africa, the observed activity, of course, being misinformation, is actually organic versus foreign sponsored by China, Russia, etc. And that's something that Mugendi just noted, that most of what he's seen has been imported from other countries. So I'm going to throw that to Jean to answer first.
Sorry, just had to unmute myself there.
No
I
problem.
think, Virash, one of the biggest issues with the kind of work that we do is attributing the disinformation at the end of the day. It's very difficult for us when we've only got the behavior to look at to actually say that this comes from Russia, or this comes from Chinese actors, or for all intents and purposes, it might come from internal actors. There is a definite drive from both the Chinese and the Russian governments into Africa. Just last year, there was, I think in October, Facebook took down a network that was operating in 7 different countries in Africa. Trying to influence elections, taking steps to favor certain political parties or certain candidates in political parties, driving divisions. And all of this was linked back to a close associate of the Russian president, who was linked to the 2016 meddling in elections in the United States. So there's always that element that you need to be aware of, but actually attributing that to a specific actor is, for us sitting on the outside of the platform, it's sometimes very difficult. What we have been seeing quite a lot more often is the platforms themselves, like Facebook and Twitter, coming to the party and saying, listen, this is a network we've identified. See if you can corroborate what we've found. Can we kind of work together on identifying and exposing these networks? And that, so far as for us at the DFR Lab, that has been an immense help.
I've been quite interested in how you and Mugendi have mentioned working with Facebook. In one of your stories, I think Tessa's stories or yours, it was quoted, Facebook thanked you guys for exposing something and they took it down. Whereas, they've gotten a bad rep in the past for having not taken strong enough steps against misinformation. Is that changing? Are they taking it seriously? What is your experience been? And then we'll go to Mugendi after you tell me your experience.
Yeah, they've got a bad rap, and I think in some ways this was a legitimate concern that people had with the way that they manage their platforms. Obviously, they've got massive reach, massive audiences, and there is some form of responsibility on them to make sure that it's not being used by bad actors. But of late, and especially in the kind of experiences that I've seen with them, they are becoming more and more proactive in identifying the networks and then taking them down where it's warranted. There's always this discussion about how far do you how much can you take down before it becomes an attack on free speech, and what amounts to censorship and whatnot. These are obviously difficult conversations, and basically where we come in is we act like a second level for them to check and verify that the network that they've identified is something that bears the hallmarks of inauthentic, coordinated behavior.
Okay. And Mugendi, how has it been in your experience?
So from what we've seen, Facebook have been really responsive in terms of taking down false information, especially things that are likely to lead to harm. So for example, claims about vaccines or claims about miracle cures or that sort of thing. And they also have, because we actually flag potentially false content on their platform, and they take down any information that violates their policies as far as this sort of communication or any abuse of the platform is concerned. So what they're doing is they're relying more on local fact checkers, or like fact checkers in country to give them some visibility on the content, because a lot of times they might not have the language or the capacity in terms of language or in terms of understanding like the local nuances to take any action. And because of this, because we're part of this alliance of fact checkers under the International Fact Checking Network, working to identify false claims about coronavirus, we're able to see any like local content that sort of matches any previous information that we've seen in other countries, and we're able to tell them this is what this looks like, and you need to take it down, and they actually do respond quite quickly.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. I hope other social networks take note and that we see more and more of that. I just want to take one more question from the audience. I hope I'm getting your name here right. Kira Tarif asks, are education systems equipped to teach the kind of analytical skills people need to distinguish between genuine information, disinformation, and misinformation? Is addressing this issue a job only for governments, or can social media companies themselves contribute to better equipping users to recognize false or misleading information? And I think that comes back to the Facebooks, but let's expand it a bit more. What more can all of us do to help educate people? What are the tools out there for ordinary people? Because when I hear people like you guys talk, Mugendi, Tessa, Jean, you guys speak about these things, and I can tell it's just instant knowledge for you. But for us who aren't au fait with these things, I'm quite surprised. I'm like, oh my goodness, there's people hiring bots. There's people. I know it's obvious, but like it just doesn't occur to us, right? When you see that very convincing thing being circulated in your WhatsApp group, it doesn't occur to you to think that way. So who should be acting? Let me maybe start with Tessa. We haven't heard from her for a while. Tessa, sorry to pick on you here, but what do you think we can do more of as a society? Who can do more to try to combat the tsunami of fake news that is taking over?
I will say it is particularly difficult. I received a WhatsApp message from a relative recently, not to name and shame, asking if eating lots of garlic would help them to not get infected. Now, I know Mugendi has seen that before. It's a quack cure that spread quite quickly. I think it's probably quite decent at keeping people away from you if you eat lots and lots of garlic, but it's not going to, it's certainly not going to ensure that you don't get infected. But I was placed in a situation where I wasn't 100% sure how to deal with that, because it's very easy for me to say, that's not true. It's a lot harder for me to say, here are the tools for you to try and interrogate it and figure out that it isn't true. So something that I've started doing by telling just my community and the people around me is when they encounter information that they think might not be true, because something to remember is a lot of the time this false information actually seems incredibly legitimate. It looks real, it feels real, it's got scientific sounding jargon in it, and it's incredibly compelling. So something that I say is check the link if you're on a news site. Check to see if there's a byline. Usually, if a journalist is not willing to put their name on something, be careful about it.
Yeah.
And rather fall back to the sources that we know are correct. But when it comes to who should be educating people and equipping people, that's a really difficult thing to answer. I think a lot of universities have started incorporating modules on fake news for their journalists, their journalism students. So that's fantastic.
Can I quickly just ask you, besides what they're learning at university and so on, what tools can people use, or what tools do you have access to that ordinary people don't, to do these kind of checks?
So at the DFO Lab, what we try and do is we base all of our investigations on using open source technology and open source software. So we're not trying to use technology and software that the average person wouldn't be able to use.
Sure.
That's really important to us. It might be a little bit difficult for people to familiarize themselves with the kind of software that we use, but our goal is for people to be able to read our articles and walk their way through it and try and replicate what it is that we do.
That's fantastic.
Obviously, when you see a piece of information that you think might be false, you're not going to go through the effort that we do in analyzing it and writing a piece on it and exposing it. But we do try and show people how to go through it. So
that's really cool, because people can then become like their own little DFR, people within their WhatsApp groups.
Digital Sherlocks. We want people to become our digital Sherlocks and join in.
Okay.
My little niece calls me an internet detective, and I've
awesome.
now done her an internet detective as well. And she is 11 now, and she goes around and she tells people what to do. And
that's cool. Because I think the nature of the conversation these days is that it's so diffuse. It's happening in these closed groups that we need change agents everywhere. And I think it's great that you guys make that stuff available on your website. So to everyone watching, go and check out DFR Lab, and also check out Code for Africa's trainings on this, because we don't all have to be data experts or research experts to be able to just do the basics of fact checking. So we've got only like 10 minutes left here. I can see there's a lot of questions happening in the Q&A. We're going to try to answer a lot of those by text. So if the panelists want to go ahead and just, while they're listening, respond to some of those questions, please go ahead. But in the last few minutes, I just want to get to to like kind of the crux of where the rubber hits the road in Africa with misinformation, and how it affects people on the ground, which Mugendi spoke to a little bit, like the very kind of real visceral effects of misinformation. It's not just pixels on a screen, it has physical effects in people's lives. And secondly, how is it, empowering the wrong kind of governments to kind of have authoritarian rule creeping in? So I'm gonna jump to John. John, I hope you were listening to that question. I'm just gonna repeat it quickly. John, what is the very visceral effects of misinformation that you have seen? And secondly, what have you seen with how misinformation is being used by authoritarian governments?
I mean, it's the effects of it is, I mean, like Chris mentioned earlier, there's been lots of studies trying to pin down exactly how much does misinformation, disinformation affect people on the ground. I think it's in addition to the study that Chris mentioned in the introduction, there was a different study which actually looked at how the same Fox News network, they took two different anchors and looked at how many people that used to watch the one anchor that was spreading misinformation, how many of them suffered or were infected with the coronavirus as compared to the ones who listened to the more balanced anchor. So, I mean, there's very real effects that can be measured. Finding a way of measuring that in a way that's scientifically sound, that's up for people that are a lot smarter than we are. But what you do get is you see people, for example, in the United Kingdom going out and burning 5G towers because they've been led to believe that it causes the coronavirus. You see people staying away from, vaccination drives or staying away from possible treatments that might have alleviated symptoms, but they chose to stay away because of the misinformation they've been fed. So the effects of it, I mean, it also depends on the region in which you're in. We all have much different effects on that thing when compared to, some of our peers overseas. But definitely there's measurable effects to that. I mean, going forward, I just think what the second part of your question was.
It was about authoritarian governments.
Yes.
And, yeah.
I mean, we've had our own bit of that. I mean, generally we've got free speech is something that's enshrined in our constitution. But at the start of the coronavirus outbreak, when the lockdowns actually started as well, our government released regulations that limited that free speech where coronavirus is concerned. And there was a lot of outcry around that because it would mean that there's being, you're being policed by the government, telling you what you can and cannot say. And I mean, there's pros and cons to that kind of approach. I mean, on the one hand, my personal feeling is that the way that our government did it it doesn't amount to authoritarianism. It was a very limited scope that they were using or there was a very limited scope of limit. So there was only information about the coronavirus that was disseminated with the intention to deceive that would have been classified as criminal. And in a case like that, there is a case to be made that it's only people who would like to whistleblow or scientists, they've still got free reign as long as their intention isn't to deceive at the end of the day. That being said, there is a major chance for governments that want to try and abuse the virus for authoritarian means to actually do that. This is
and we've seen that happening in Hungary, I think, right? Hungary, Brazil, so countries where they were already that kind of leaning. But I think you're right to say that the way it was done in South Africa was correct, because we saw the guy who said that testing kits were contaminated get arrested. And I think we're all quite grateful for that here in South Africa. Chris, you had something to say about authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think two things. One is I think that Mugendi probably could tell us a bit more about what's happening in Tanzania in terms of how misinformation is being used by the government to shut down various avenues of free speech. But also, just to Jean, maybe you could talk a bit about the kind of dog whistle effect of the kind of right-wing bros that we see in South Africa who are talking about the terrible government trying to take away our civil rights and it's worse than Stalin, blah, blah, etc. And about how they're using that kind of threat of creeping authoritarianism to kind of push us into their worldview as well. And maybe explain to the audience what dog whistle is, and then we can go to Mugendi. If that's okay, Rush.
That's really useful.
Yeah.
No, I think that's great.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it does, on the face of it, it seems like the government is impacting our free speech. But I mean, what we've seen with a lot of these, fringe media persons and people running their YouTube channels and getting viewerships on, They thrive on that kind of, this is what the media doesn't want you to see. This is what the government doesn't want to tell you. So for them, the moment that these regulations came out, it suddenly became like this, oh my goodness, look at what the government's doing. They're coming for after your free speech. They're coming to try and shut down any discussions. They're trying to shut down us, your only true voice of truth and reason. So what a lot of them are doing is they're actually inciting these fears amongst people who, for lack of, for better or worse, wouldn't have known any better. They now suddenly see these podcasts being told about how the government is shutting down free speech and how the government is, shutting down any kind of dissent about the government and how it works, which isn't actually the truth. I mean, there's a very sound legal reasoning behind the way that these regulations were drafted. And there's a lot of legal and constitutional law experts that have indicated that the narrow framing of these regulations wouldn't, cut into our or at least make it compliant with the limitations clause within the Constitution. The fact that it's being then abused for viewership numbers and to generate some outrage, that's,
It's part of the course, right, in the world we live in. We've only got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to jump to Mugendi quickly. As Chris said, we're seeing this happening across the continent. I mentioned the Malawian president who told everyone, or Madagascan, I think, president, that he's invented a herbal cure for the virus. And we see Pastor Chris in Nigeria. I don't know what he's telling his followers these days, but it's pretty scary. So what are you seeing in your region, Mugendi, that we should be aware of?
So this has been happening for a while in Tanzania, where the government basically says that any data or any information that is used in reporting has to be from the government. So the government is the only credible source of information. So anyone who's looking to verify the actual situation on the ground needs to first check in with the government and then get permission to go and do their actual research, which in turn has led to like a stifling of the media. And then it's also crept into some really serious platforms where a lot of these conversations were happening. Like there's one called Jamii Forums, where the founder was actually arrested because there was some conversations, some social conversations happening on the platform. And then the way these things happen is that you get arrested and then you're accused of abusing the internet in some of these countries. And we've seen laws like those in Kenya, where the government comes in and starts to regulate speech or the use of these platforms by saying that what you're saying is counter to national security. So it's actually, that's how they start coming for people sharing information on these platforms. So they're trying to censor the conversations of these platforms, which then takes people further underground, which means that we as fact checkers aren't able to see any of these false conversations or false information until it's probably too late.
That is shocking. Oh, wow. What a step backwards for that government. It's really just shooting itself in the foot. We've unfortunately run out of time. I'm just going to take one last quick comment from Tessa, and then I'm going to wrap up. Tessa, last thoughts, 1 minute or less. Have I lost Tessa?
No, she's on mute.
Ah.
Oh, sorry. I'm
yes.
Now. I think the current conversation was just covered. So all I really want to say is thank you, everyone. And I know we have a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to. Thank you for all of those. Please do drop us a line. You can grab us on Twitter. I'm a wild knight. I think both myself and Jean, and I don't want to speak for Mugendi, but for everyone that has all of these questions, and particularly the people who are interested in knowing the tools that we use, do just drop us a line and we'll be very happy to get back to you on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tessa. Thank you, Chris, for this opportunity. Back to you. Oh, you're muted, Chris. So maybe let's hear that beautiful voice.
To end with. Thanks very much to the panelists. A massive topic, which I guess we've only just started to unpack. I just want to ask the audience to please follow Code for Africa on Twitter, DFR Labs on Twitter, and explain.coza on Twitter. And we'll be posting more and more information around the fight against disinformation and the fight for truth. So please follow us there, and we'll let you know when the next event's going to happen. Thanks very much.
Cool. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.